Hey everyone, and welcome to The Year Was, the podcast all about today that gives you just enough information to effectively be that guy at the party, causing all your friends to question, hey, who invited you? Like, seriously, why are you here? I'm your host, Michael Montalvo, and for the next few minutes we will open history's door and find out what makes today truly unique. On this episode, we examine the events that occurred November 20th. True story. I wrote half an episode before I realized I was working on the wrong day, and instead of finishing and posting early, I decided my best course of action was to scrap everything and start over. Because honestly, I hate myself and I am punishing myself for not getting it right. So here I am, currently sitting, typing at the time of writing, and now recording the night before this is due, racing to the finish line, as if I was Ken Miles, gunning for first at the 24 Hours of Le Mans. And now I find it necessary to say this isn't an episode about Ken Miles or racing. I just watched Ford v Ferrari, and I wanted to use that imagery. Instead, imagine, if you will, being in Nuremberg, Germany, 1945, where 22 Nazi war criminals are being tried for war crimes. In this case, war crimes refers to conspiracy, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity. And while many of us know the term, how many of us know what it means to have committed a war crime? Relatively speaking, it's a new term to us. A clear definition didn't exist until after the First World War. The horrors that the soldiers faced gave birth to discussions about war crimes and the punishments for the men who committed them. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 was actually one of the first documents to discuss this, and its authors attempted to create a list that informed the world of what exactly qualified as a war crime. They argued and disagreed about what would and wouldn't be criminalized during a time of war, and they found even more disagreement when it came time to determining a punishment. An international court of justice was also considered, but was not accepted, and not much happened for a while. Then World War II happened, and with it, war crimes were brought up again in greater detail. Today, war crimes are referred to as violations of the customs or laws of warfare, which brings us to October 1943. U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin all signed the Moscow Declaration of German Atrocities. And that basically said this: the Germans responsible for any atrocities, massacres, or executions would be sent to the country in which the action took place in order to be judged and punished according to the laws of said nation. Not all crimes could be assigned to a nation, and so it was determined all major war criminals whose crimes could not be assigned to a geographic location would be punished by joint decision of the Allied governments. These trials would be before an international military tribunal, and the most well-known of these took place in Nuremberg, Germany. Many of the people tried were low-level, or prisoners of war, but over time they expanded on this and included concentration camp guards, commandants, and people who committed crimes against Jewish people, and others who suffered prosecution in an area that the Allies now had control over. What this meant was that civilian officials, in addition to military officials, could and would be tried. Now, aside from the reasons I already mentioned for trying criminals in the nation of the crime, Allied officials were also interested in the denazification of Germany. And with this came the reconstruction of the German court system as a much-needed step to get back on the right track. Nuremberg was chosen as the location of the trials for a few reasons. The Palace of Justice was mostly undamaged and housed a large prison area, and Nuremberg was also the site of annual propaganda rallies. So its selection as a trial location would be viewed as a symbolic end to Hitler's government. The best known of these trials was the trial of the major war criminals, and that's how we get to November 20th. The year was 1945, and on this day, the Nuremberg Trials began. These trials were held between 1945 and 1949 with the sole purpose of bringing the men responsible to justice. 24 Nazi war criminals were indicted, with a few notable exceptions. One man was deemed unfit for trial, and another killed himself before trial began. And of the notable absences through all of this were Adolf Hitler and his two top men, Heinrich Himmler and Joseph Goebbels, who were never brought to trial because they committed suicide as the war was ending. Each of the defendants were allowed to choose their own lawyers, and the go-to defense was ex post facto. For those unfamiliar with the term, it basically means that they committed the crimes before they were crimes, and as such could not be tried for them. Another defense was that it was just a case of Victor's justice. But who is Victor, I hear you ask? Well, he's not just my cousin. Victor's justice states that the victor applies harsher penalties to the crimes committed by the loser, in this case the Germans, and leniency to the crimes committed by their own soldiers. What's actually pretty cool about this whole trial is that the defendants and the judges spoke 4 different languages. And because of this, IBM actually provided the technology and recruited men and women from international telephone exchanges to provide an on-the-spot instant translation through headphones in English, French, German, and Russian. How did it end? The tribunal found all but 3 guilty. 12 were sentenced to death, 1 in absentia, and the rest were given prison sentences that ranged from 10 years to life. 10 of the men sentenced to death were executed by hanging on the 16th of October 1946. Hermann Göring, who was Hitler's designated successor, committed suicide the night before his execution with a cyanide capsule he had hidden in a jar of medication. Following the trial of major war criminals, 12 additional trials were held in Nuremberg, lasting from December 1946 to April of 1949. These included the doctor's trial, where 23 defendants were charged with crimes against humanity, including medical experiments on prisoners of war. The judge's trial, where 16 judges and lawyers were charged with furthering the Nazi plan for racial purity by implementing the eugenics law of the Third Reich. And other trials dealt with German industrialists accused of using slave labor and plundering. High-ranking officers accused of atrocities against prisoners of war, and SS officers accused of violence against concentration camp inmates. Of the 185 people indicted, 12 were given the death penalty, 8 were given life in prison, and 77 were given a prison sentence of some length. However, authorities would later reduce the number of sentences. Some things that resulted from this, though, were the United Nations Genocide Convention, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the Geneva Convention on the Laws and Customs of War. What you may not realize was that much of what we know about the concentration camps came from eyewitness accounts that were first brought to light in these trials. The justifications for the trials and the procedures created for the processes were a bit controversial at the time, with U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice Harlan Stone even calling them sanctimonious fraud and a high-grade lynching party. But today, the Nuremberg trials are widely regarded as a milestone in the establishment of an international court, as well as setting a precedent for dealing with future occurrences of genocide and crimes against humanity. And that's going to do it for us today. If you like this podcast and want to hear more, give us a rate and a review. That helps me out and helps me steer this in the right direction. Hopefully one that's good for all. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can find the audio version on your podcast app of choice. Links in the description. You can find me on social media and at YouTube at the Apple Cider Club. And as always, I want to thank the Tim Kreitz Band for our musical theme. And thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.